Hello everyone. This Prezi presentation, which is accessible through Blackboard, is designed to give you basically the Middle Ages in a nutshell. The Middle Ages in England in a nutshell. And it is a very rich history and one that cannot in depth be covered here, but we will do our best to give an overview of the Middle Ages. And some of these things will inform your understanding of works like Beowulf and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. So the Middle Ages, as you can see here, is basically is marked as ending in the 15th century, 1485. In fact, it is usually dated from the collapse of the Roman Empire in the 5th century or the 400s. In fact, in your Norton, it marks it as 420 Common Era. Um, and this is about the time when the Roman Empire collapses. In fact, the Romans who had occupied um, England at the time retreat back to back to Rome, back to the Italian area, to Italy, and defend their defend Rome from invasions of the Goths. So more tribes like that, and so that kind of leaves a power vacuum. In fact, there's major linguistic changes during this time. You have the Anglo-Saxons. We will talk about how they feature in England in a moment. And then later on, you'll have the Anglo-Normans, and you'll also have Middle English coming into development as well. Let's see. In fact, the earliest form of English, Old English, is not really much English at all. It's more of an older Germanic language. It looks more German than it does English as we know it today, or modern English. And so a lot of language during this time was performed orally and written throughout the Middle Ages. The earliest time I think we have written documents is the 7th century. Before then, a lot of it was orally passed down. And the language system just changes a lot. It's a very diverse linguistic period as far as linguistic development is concerned. So, for instance, there's no actual unique pride in English language until the 1300s. And this is marked with Chaucer usually, who brings more attention to vernacular English. And that's one of the reasons that Chaucer is considered important is for how his poetry being written in the English vernacular gave more attention to it. Because before then, as it says here, the vernacular English was starting to displace French as language for business and parliament. French, an old French variety, was implemented in 1066 among the nobility. And so that's another thing to keep in mind. The structure of society is nobility, church, and then everybody else, pretty much. And that's how it goes up until after the bubonic plague. So it is also becoming more possible to obtain patronage for writing in English, such as Chaucer, who's otherwise known as the English Homer. So book production was an expensive process during this time. Until movable type, in the 1400s or 15th century, manuscripts were reproduced by hand, and manuscripts were always in the possession of the monasteries. So you had two classes of intellectuals. You had the nobility who would take up learning at times, but mainly you had the monks in the monasteries, especially when things were written in Latin. That would be the monks in the monasteries. Monasteries' main centers of production in the Anglo-Saxon period. In fact, as I said before, there were no books until the church came with Rome. Well, no, until the church. I apologize. Until Christianity was introduced into England, which was later. Commercial bookmaking doesn't even develop until the 13th century. Even then, mainly produced for wealthy patrons, so literacy was in the hands of the few. Small portion of medieval books survived. Why? Because of the Reformation period, which we'll get into more when we talk about Henry VIII, which is more in the 1530s, which gets more into the Renaissance era. So Anglo-Saxon literature, when we mention Anglo-Saxon literature, we're talking about things like Beowulf. And so just a little bit of history of the Anglo-Saxon era. So after the Romans returned to Rome, there is basically a power vacuum to protect it from the Germanic invasion, leaving England vulnerable to invasion. So kind of, the Britons are basically kind of having a no shit moment as far as, what are we going to do? Our protectors, the Romans who built all these roads for us, are leaving, and there's the Picts and the Scotty tribes who are threatening us. And so what they do is they invite the Saxons, who are a Germanic tribe, Northern Germanic. So if you think of modern day Germany and in the northern area, that's where the Saxons are usually said to be hailing from, is northern, what's modern day northern Germany. So the Saxons come over and they help them fight, and then basically the Saxons are like, you know what, this is a pretty nice place. We think we'll stay here. And they do. And they do. And so they take control of England during this time. And eventually, in things like 597 Common Era, they adopt Christianity, and then that's where books come from. But even then, it's not necessarily totally stable. If you've seen a series like The Last Kingdom, it dramatizes things like the Danish invasion, the Vikings, or the Danes, sorry. And then you have people like King Alfred, King of the West Saxons, who curbs those invasions. And so the Anglo-Saxons rule for that time. Usually 6th century on to 1066. Old English poetry is usually retained in the West Saxon dialect. Again, a Germanic tribe that came to England to help the Britons, but then took control themselves. Old English poetry. Earliest records begin in 7th century, so the 600s. And the poetry of that time, the oral heroic poetry, shares similarities with the Greeks, or the Greek Homer. So things like the Iliad and the Odyssey, if you've ever had the privilege of reading that, it's very things like Beowulf share a lot of similarities with those narratives. And just to talk a little bit about the culture of this time, for instance, king as a word has a relationship to this idea of kinship. That's where the word king comes from. And tribes. And that's what a king would do during this time. There was an exchange. There was an agreement. He would lead men in the battle and reward them with spoils. That was their exchange. He would get what he wants as far as political power and influence, and they would get spoils in return, which is kind of difficult when you're, I say mixing a pagan and Christian, which that's really true. It's really difficult. You're like, you preach a religion of peace and forgiveness, for instance, but then you're invading villages and plundering them. Retainers in turn fight for the king to the death. They pledge their loyalty and they show their loyalty, and things like blood vengeance. If someone dies in the under the leadership of the king, blood vengeance is a sacred duty. In fact, when we get to Beowulf, we'll talk about things like Wergild. You'll see Wergild a lot, where someone dies and somebody has to pay that debt back. There's a price for each man that gets paid to the family or gets paid to the tribe. If you've seen The Last Kingdom, it shows up there as well. Anglo-Norman literature. So in 1066, there's the Battle of Hastings, and the Normans, who are also Germanic but have eventually settled in northern France, invade England and outs the Saxons from power. So let's see, they are great. Some of the things they're known for: great builders of castles. In fact, the earliest kings of the Anglo-Norman time period were often absent to protect their continental possessions. And it's a French-speaking ruling class, so like if you were in in the lower classes, there would be some more vernacular English, Old English, and developing in towards Middle English, especially when we get to Chaucer. While the aristocracy was speaking French. Or they would also be speaking Latin, the language of learning, and the language of trade, which is what lingua franca is. So tales of chivalry and romance of chivalry, and those tales include things like a knight proving his worthiness through nobility of character and brave deeds, which you'll definitely see in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. That comes from the Anglo-Normans. In fact, interesting fact, we're not going to get to read Morte Arthur, but the tales of Arthur and Lancelot and the Lancelot cycle, those come from France, not England, surprisingly. I mean, they might have been, as far as being written down, they come from France. They started there. This is always interesting to me since, Arthur and Lancelot are supposed to be such English figures, and yet they derive from France. So Middle English literature in the 14th and 15th centuries. This is the 1300s and 1400s. We're getting near the end of this. So the 14th, and a lot happens during this time. War and disease were prevalent throughout the Middle Ages, but never more devastating than during the 14th century, the 1300s. So there are campaigns by the Normans, the Anglo-Normans, in 1346, where there's victories and Poitiers. So taking parts of the lands of France, but um, even those get lost eventually because they're frittered away. Other things are going on. 1348, first and most virulent epidemic of the bubonic plague, that is the Black Death, wiping out a quarter to a third of the population. That's a lot. That is significant. Mass graves, popular, and so you have that. If you think about it, think of a pie. Take one third of that pie away, and then imagine that being like every little part of that pie are people who hold jobs and perform a function in society. They're gone. So there's a vacuum there. There's a void that needs to be filled. In fact, as it says here, there's more possibilities for social mobility here because you need people to replace the people that were lost by the Black Death. And so this leads to discontent and uprisings and expansion for possibilities for social mobility. However, people in power are often very traditionalists and don't like social mobility. They like to keep things the way they are so they can retain their own power. So, for example, 1381, there were attempts to enforce wage controls and collect oppressive new taxes. These led to uprisings. Events such as burning down the palace of the Duke of Lancaster, beheading an Archbishop of Canterbury. So, if we think killing a king later on in the 17th century is sacrilegious, they were doing it back in the 14th century. So like there was a lot of there's a lot of shock and awe when kings get executed because the kings were seen as being appointed by God. Or like even in 1789 there was that same kind of shock and awe. But it would be happening with authority figures, even of the church, like the Archbishop of Canterbury and Treasurer of England. And so the church itself was targeted as resentment because it was seen as it was actually one of the greatest oppressive landowners there was. The church owned a lot of land, and they would milk it for what it was worth. In fact, I remember reading about monks who would be on the roads to collect tolls, and they would basically be like mafia. They would beat you down and take money from you. That's how the narrative goes. So the 15th century, leading up, we're in 1399. Henry IV deposes Richard II. So Henry IV, Bolingbroke, House of Lancaster, deposes Richard II from the House of York, and this leads to that's also. And then Richard II dies under questionable circumstances, and that also leads to questions about legitimacy of the throne, which in turn leads to a civil war, also known as the War of the Roses. So after Henry V dies in 1422, the War of the Roses breaks out. If you had a red rose, you were loyal to the House of Lancaster. If you had a white rose, you were loyal to the House of York. And this whole history of the struggle between the Lancasters and the Yorks is actually dramatized very well by Shakespeare in his history plays. You have Henry IV, you have Henry V, and then you have Henry and you go on with those, and you even have Richard III, where the war is ended. And Richard III is demonized. But there's a reason Richard III is demonized because, it doesn't end until 1485 with the ascension of Henry Tudor, Henry VII, who defeats Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth. And so Elizabeth I, when we get to her, is a descendant of Henry Tudor. And also Henry Tudor married someone from the House of York to try to bring peace to the houses, and that's what ends the civil war between the two. So things that are common throughout the 15th century: portrayals of Wheel of Fortune because it's a very unstable time, religious censorship through burning of heretics in 1401. Some religious works were in the vernacular, and some things like mystery plays got their start in the 15th century. Mystery plays, plays had not been going on, since the time. Law plays had not been going on since the time of the Greeks. And then in the 15th century, there's more permissiveness, like passion plays start on the continent, and then we eventually get mystery plays, which are more, mystery plays or morality plays. Mystery plays would dramatize, Christian stories, and then morality plays would bring Christianity into allegorical things like Everyman. If you've ever read Everyman, fortunately, we won't have time to read it here, but that is a morality play, and that is basically the Middle Ages in a nutshell. It might give you some more understanding of what's going on in things like Beowulf and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. So Beowulf, for instance, and this will also carry on in the Chaucer when we get there next week. So Beowulf, Anglo-Saxon, and then we go on from there. Alright, so if there's any questions, please let me know.